Well, Tuesday next week, I'm told, will be 100 days for Donald Trump as president. So the news is beginning to fill up with stories about his approval ratings at this point. But I don't know about you, but 100 days has always seemed to me quite a short amount of time to work out whether someone is good or is bad. So give you some examples. Here are some famous names. You have Donald Trump's predecessor. You have the architects of independence in Kenya and in Singapore. There's Margaret Thatcher, the first female Prime Minister of Britain and longest serving Prime Minister in the modern era. And there's Winston Churchill, hero of World War II. But for all of those names, there would be people who are kind of wildly in favor. And also some other people with serious questions. And for lots of them, there's a sort of moment in their life where if you could pause the story at that point, everyone would agree that they were wonderful and lovely. Or actually, I think in Churchill's case, it's the other way around. If you pause Churchill's life in 1936, you'd be very, very negative. But then almost everything he ever did is sort of neutralized by one darkest hour. So what do you make of people? Good or bad, looking at their whole records, their whole life? Well, open up chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. It's page 327. We have reached the end of 1 and 2 Samuel. Finally, you might be thinking. And we've got 4 more chapters, which we're going to look at over 3 weeks here at Sunday morning. 4 more chapters, but it is not 4 more years of David in power. It's not even in order. It's not even years in order telling the story. What we have here is a verdict, mainly from David himself. This is an approval rating. And it's not after 100 days. So if you look, chapter 22, verse 1, tells us that is the song he sang after the Lord delivered him from Saul. So that's very early on. But then turn the page again, look at 23, verse 1. These are the last words of David. And I think, as May read, you probably will have heard that chapter 21 is all about transitions. So it begins, we're paying reparations for the debts of the previous administration. So that's the kind of thing you do early in your rule. But then look at verse 17 of 21. That is about David's retirement, or at least his retirement as a soldier. David, he had been a sort of one-man army. David, the super soldier who killed tens of thousands. But this day, verse 15, one more battle is nearly too many. It says he became exhausted, and it raises the prospect of the death of the king. Maybe he'll die. Maybe we will need a new king. We don't know exactly when this happened. We know David was king until he was 70 years old. So at some point, he's still going out to battle when really he should have given that up. And he became exhausted. The enemy can clearly tell, so maybe he collapsed on the battlefields. And this man, Ishbi-Benob, if he can kill David, then the lights go out. So the army swears an oath. They swear an oath. They say, we are not going to let you go to battle ever again, old man. They don't say that last bit, but I think that's what they meant. So there's debts, there's retirements, there's also unfinished business in this chapter. So the end bit where you've got 4 enemy champions, and they all fight for the Philistines, and they're all related, their family, one of the Rapha. They are huge. Verse 19, we learn one of them is the brother of Goliath. This is the unfinished business in David's career, the Philistines and the giants. So we're coming to the end of David's life. That's what these 4 chapters will be about. Has he been a good king or a bad king? And you may be thinking, why should I care? Why should I care? This is thousands of years ago. Why should we care? Well, I think we should care because behind all of this is a job advert. That's maybe a slightly blasphemous way to think about it, but there is a real living man applying for a significant role in your life. The man that we've been thinking about through Good Friday and Easter, Jesus. Jesus, he is offering to be your David and my shepherd and our king. I don't know if you've seen that the media are just beginning to run slightly sneery stories about the quiet revival that is happening in Christianity in the UK. Have you seen any of those? So thousands of new people are going to church at the moment, and they are especially younger men from Generation Z. And they are going especially to more conservative, more traditional versions of Christianity. So maybe, if you're here today, if you're 20 and you're considering giving Jesus a significant role in your life, well, here is where you come to measure and to weigh him. Or maybe if you're 50 and you've been following Jesus for 40 years, well, here is where you come when it feels like following him is too hard, is too costly. Because when Jesus says he is the anointed one of Israel, the Messiah, here is where we come to know what he means. And the books of Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel, they have one basic answer for us. It's a one-line job description. They say that the king should be humble. Everybody else, all the other nations, they have a king who tells God what to do. Whereas God's people are only safe if they have a king who is told what to do by God. So let me show you. There are 3 songs that dominate these books of Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel. There is Hannah's prayer right at the very beginning. There's David's lament in the middle. And then there is the double song that we've got in our chapters, chapter 22 and chapter 23. And they all say the same thing. I've put some examples on the screen behind me. They all say the Lord humbles the proud or the haughty, and he exalts the humble. It's all about movement up or movement down. If you try and take on God, if you try and replace God, well, then he will break you. That is why Saul fell. How the mighty have fallen, David says in 2 Samuel 1. And all the way through the book, God saves the humble, lifts them up, and he brings low the proud, the haughty. So here is the basic shape. It's not very sophisticated drawing, I'm sorry about that, but this is the basic shape of the book. So Eli and his sons, up and then down. Samuel's sons even, down. And then Saul, this is his life. Saul is on stage for 24 out of 55 of the chapters, but actually he never goes away. Did you see 21 verse 1? It is on account of Saul. And then 22 verse 1, when the Lord delivered David from Saul, we're still talking about Saul. Saul, he rose, he then became proud, and he defied God, and he fell. How the mighty have fallen. So that's Saul. But what about David? What kind of approval rating would he get? I think you'd expect this, wouldn't you, this pattern? When he was humble, God made him rise until he replaced Saul. But then, if you've been with us over the last few months, we have seen it all go so very, very wrong. He seems worse than Saul, doesn't he? We've seen sexual violence and murder and cover-up, and then a civil war right through the middle of his family. So you would think that it should be all over for the house of David, which is why we're here in these last chapters. We want to know, is it over? Or maybe you want to know, why isn't it over? Why isn't David in prison after what he's done? And the answer in these chapters, it comes in a very carefully arranged pattern. I hope you know, these Bible books, they were not just sort of thrown together by idiots. So in chapters 21 to 24, we have all of the S's. So we have sins and soldiers and songs. And through the chapters, they are all about the king. Chapter 21 is the sins of Saul and also the soldiers of David. And then chapter 22, the song of the king that God gives victory to, the king that God is kind to. But the book doesn't just do that once. So this is what we actually have. There's a pattern. Everything is doubled. Everything is mirrored. Chapter 24 is also about atoning for the sins of a king. But this time it is King David, not King Saul. And then 23 has another list of soldiers, David's soldiers, and what they did and didn't do. And then the heart of it all are two songs, not just one song. One of these songs written by a young man, maybe he's 30, and he is at the peak of the wave, upwards. That's chapter 22. And then the other song written by an older man, maybe of about 70. It's more reflective. It's wondering who he is, wondering what is next. And for this week, that pattern is all I need you to know about these 4 chapters, the sort of epilogue to the book. We need to know there will not just be one approval number for David. There will be 2. David's life, it's complex rather than binary. So chapter 22 is true. It is true. But it is not the whole truth about David. Chapter 23 is true as well. And it will be in David's strengths and also in his failures that we will come to trust in the Lord Jesus. So we've got, 15, 20 minutes left, and I'll try and take us through this chapter 21 with these 4 headings to take us through the chapter. So starting with broken oath and kept oath. These first verses, they cover some brutal territory. This is like the day when the International War Crimes Tribunal shows up in the capital city. So if you look at verse 2, Saul, he had tried to annihilate the Gibeonites. And if you want to do more reading on this, then write down Joshua chapter 9. Joshua 9 in your notes, because that's the backstory. I think they'll stop honking in a bit. That'll be good. Let me tell you some of what you need to know. So the Gibeonites were resident aliens. They're not part of Israel. Racially, it says they were the survivors of the Amorites. So they're resident aliens, but they absolutely have indefinite leave to remain. In fact, Joshua and the people of Israel, they swore them an oath. It says that in verse 2. It was an oath before Yahweh their God, and it guaranteed their lives and their cities. You will have a permanent place within the borders of Israel. But you might also want to know, as background, that their cities, they were large and they were prosperous and they were strong. In Joshua it says, like one of the royal cities. And also you might want to know that those cities were all in Benjamin, so in King Saul's heartland. So if you are a king, just like all the other nations have, this is really a no-brainer. And Saul, verse 2, he has zeal for Israel and Judah. So who cares? Who cares about an oath? Who cares about a promise? Who cares about the gods who guaranteed that promise forever? Because if you want to build a strong nation, from Saul's point of view, well, genocide and murder and theft, they are the obvious weapons of nation building. But Saul miscalculated. This is a nation ruled by God, not ruled by him. And so verse 1, there is a famine to draw attention to the unpaid debt. It says for 3 successive years. And maybe we think 3 years of bad harvest, maybe that means that you're down to the really boring food in the the back aisle of Tesco. That's all we've got left. So pasta every day with nothing on it. But that is because we live in a privileged world with freezers and cans of food and storage. In their world, their society, most people bought their food for the day with the money that they earned that day. They had nothing in the cupboard at home at all. And even farmers, so farmers would have enough grain to eat and to plant next year's harvest, but probably no more. Maybe the richest farmers might have enough to eat and plant and a little bit left over in spare. But no one has enough to still be eating or planting if the rains don't fall for 3 consecutive years. Famines have a kind of tipping point where the death of tens of thousands of people becomes inevitable. So the situation is terrifying, and the way out of it is hideous, isn't it? The chapter as it was read. The Gibeonites, they lay their charge. Thousands of us have been murdered. The rest are homeless as refugees. Saul is dead. So where is our justice? And David, he wants to pay reparations. Did you see verse 3, verse 4? Silver or gold is what he has in mind. And I think we should see that as a good sign about David. What could David have said? David could have shrugged his shoulders. We're upset with Saul. He could have said, yeah, me too. Who had been trying to kill David for year after year after year? David had been homeless, a refugee, on the run from Saul, mistreated. He could have said, I am not to blame for his crimes. He hated me. But there is something different about the sins of a king. Certainly the sins of the king of God's people. Saul represented the nation, and he represented God. And the nation and God had promised to keep the Gibeonites safe. And Yahweh is the keeper of that oath. So David, he wants to pay. He wants to make it right. Until they ask for 7 deaths to pay. 7 descendants of Saul, verse 6. They want them to be killed. And then they want their bodies exposed before the Lord. So that is about symbolic justice and shame. Have 7 sons in place of the thousands who the father killed. And you have them impaled on sticks so that they will rot and be eaten as those clearly cursed by God. And looking at the background of this, the commentaries, they agree that David doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to say yes, but he feels forced to. And then the commentaries disagree on whether this was a sort of lawful and good solution or not. So the sons, they are not guilty of Saul's crime. And the law of Moses says you should not punish the innocent for the guilty. And so there's a sort of ambiguity. There's also an ambiguity about what God thinks about this. Did you notice? It's not the deaths that lead to the famine being lifted. It's actually something else by the time we get to verse 14. So there's things about this that are not clear, I think. But what is clear is a comparison between David and Saul. And it's a comparison about promises. When we spoke earlier about the last promise that you had made, I don't know if it was a difficult one. I think most of us have known the experience of actually this would be costly to keep. And I slightly regret promising you that I'd do that because now that's the space that David is in. And here, remember this is about evaluating him as king. Early on, here it is a comparison of a good king and a bad king. So having made a promise, Saul, he genocidally breaks a solemn oath because there is land and money and power in it for him. And then in verse 7, we're just told that David had made an oath too. We're reminded. It's an oath that he made in 1 Samuel. And it is not an oath that makes any sense at all in the rule book of how to be an Iron Age king. Because David, he swore an oath to Jonathan, who was Saul's son. And like the Gibeonite oath, it was sworn before the Lord as witness and keeper of the promise. And it was sworn back in the days when Jonathan was a powerful prince and David was a refugee. But that has changed now. David is now the king on the throne, and any child of Saul is a threat to his rule. So again, if you are a king, like all the other nations have, this is a no-brainer, isn't it? Who cares about an oath? This is your opportunity, David. All you have to say, I'm sorry, memory of Jonathan. I tried to protect your kids, but the Gibeonites came. It was very difficult. We had this debt to pay. I'm sorry, the famine. And it's his opportunity to get rid of them all. Look at verse 7. The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord. So there is point one on the approval rating, and therefore item one on the job description for Jesus. No matter what, the humble king of God's people is the one who keeps his promise. Saul did not, but this day David did, even to his enemy's grandson, even kind of handed to him on a plate, which tells us that Jesus, he will keep his promise to us no matter what. Okay, second, blood guilt atoned. Chapter 21, chapter 24, they are both about how to atone for the sins of a king. And I think we understand that in part because we get angry about war crimes or about dictators and we cry for justice. But we miss the scale of the problem, I think, in God's kingdom. So God, he is the opposite of injustice and sin. He cannot be close to it at all. And his king is supposed to be part of the solution to sin. Someone has talked about it this way, that the king is one of the three lab technicians of the Old Testament. So Simon is preaching at the moment at 5:30, and he happens to be preaching through the three jobs, the three lab technicians of the Old Testament. The Old Testament tells us we need help with our sin. We need three specialist technicians to enable sinners to live close to God. We need a prophet to tell us not to sin. We need a priest to atone for us when we sin and bring us forgiveness. And we need a king to hold us back from sin and to rescue the innocent from those who sin against them. Prophet, priest, and king, the three lab technicians of the Old Testament. So when Saul goes off the rails, this is far, far worse than when you or I do that. His broken oath, that's the third commandment. And then certainly there's coveting, isn't there? The 10th commandment, as he wants their land and their wealth, his racially different neighbors. But then there's also murder and there is theft. So the guilt of the king must be paid for. And the horror of this chapter, I think we need to say it's not the final word on this. There will be much more to say in chapter 24. But it's clear, verse 1, that royal blood guilt, Saul and his blood-stained house, needs to be atoned for in blood. So they do this gruesome ceremony with the 7 sons on the poles. And tell me whether you'll come with me on these parallels. See if you will or not. You tell me afterwards, and it'll be much clearer by 24. But here we have, in this chapter, innocent royal sons who are handed over to some Gentiles by Jewish leaders in order that they can be impaled on sticks, hung on trees before God. And they are wept over by a woman of remarkable courage, and then they are buried in the grave of a wealthy, honorable man. What do you think? Do you see parallels there to Jesus and his death, to what we looked at through Good Friday and Easter Sunday? Certainly, by the time we get to chapter 24, we are drawing explicit lines to the death of Jesus and the cross. 24, 21 together, they're preparing the ground. What do you do with the sins of your people? What do you do with the sin of a king in particular? For now in 21, just let the horror of the guilt and the horror of the blood sacrifice here, let that be a bit more ink in the job description for Jesus. Where would we find a king who is willing to take on the guilt of his predecessors and his people? Where would you find someone who would offer his own innocent royal self in utter shame and death in order to pour out his blood to deal with the anger of a holy God who hates injustice? Who would do that willingly? Where would you find someone? Can you see why Generation Z might want to bring all their questions of unanswered guilt to the man Jesus who died on a cross for them? Okay, that's second. Third, humble grief honoured. So turn across to verse 10, and we're going to look now at Rizpah. Probably Merab, the other mother, is dead now. But it does draw attention to the fact this is all close family. I don't know if you have been watching the Amazon Prime series. So Merab and Michal are both kind of starring roles in there. It's the big love story with David. If you read more of 1 and 2 Samuel, you'll see that David nearly married Merab, ended up married to Michal. There's even possibility in the footnote here that Merab might have died sometime before, and these children have been raised by Michal, David's estranged wife. So there is terrible personal tragedy everywhere. David, he has loved this family as well as warred with it. So Rizpah is the mother on the scene who watches all this happen. And the bodies are exposed for months. That is the plan. It's actually, I watched the last episode of this TV series last night, and it's what David says to Goliath. He says, "The birds and the beasts, they will eat your flesh." In other words, no burial, no honor, only the curse of God and the shame of your guilt. That's the plan. But Rizpah, Saul's concubine, she decides that she will not let that happen. Verse 10, she's not allowed to take the bodies down. She doesn't have power in that way. She's not a soldier, so she can't fight the guards and steal them in the way that the men of Jabesh Gilead did for Saul in verse 12. But they will allow her to sit weeping on the ground below them. So she turns the entire rock into a burial site. She covers it in sackcloth, and they will allow her to stay there and try and drive off the vultures and the jackals. I'm not quite sure how did she have a big stick? Did she pick up rocks and throw? You think how that must have gone for her. I've seen some of the media slightly complaining about the fact that we were sent pictures of Pope Francis's corpse lying instead. Well, how gruesome. Think how gruesome this is. Rizpah, she spends weeks, day and night, around the rotting bodies of her sons and her step-grandchildren. To achieve what she achieved, she must have hardly slept, don't you think? What did she eat? What did she drink? How did she shelter? How was she safe? What did people say to her as they went past? Tell her to give up. Tell her to stop. You wonder, did anyone help her? But she is absolutely determined. These sons, they did nothing wrong, and she refuses the shame that has been placed on them. It's as if she's saying, until this kills me, I will not allow this to happen. And verse 11, they tell David, which is a moment of risk for Rizpah and for David, isn't it? So a king, like all the others, would see this at least as a political protest. So yes, she's not being violent, but she is loud and she is public, she's critical. It'd be so easy to say this is treason. A normal king would move to silence her. Verse 11, David, he does something else. Something that goes all the way back to song number 2 and the events of 2 Samuel 1 and 2. You would expect David to hate the house of Saul and to honor those who hurt them. But again and again and again, we see David's humility in the way he loves even his enemy and the way he honors those who help Saul. So back in those chapters, he honored the men of Jabesh Gilead when they took down the bones of Saul and of Jonathan. But now he really does it properly. So the bones of the grandfather and of the beloved son, and now all of these new bones, the sons and the grandsons, they are gathered and placed in the tomb of Saul's father, as if the record was wiped clean, as if they rested among the honored dead of God's people. And then look at verse 14, they did everything the king commanded, and after that, God answered prayer on behalf of the land. So the famine doesn't stop when the Gibeonites get their blood price and presumably bless Israel as they promised to, verse 3. It doesn't stop when the bodies stay on the spikes for day after day after day. It stops when the king does something humble and surprising. Stops when he recognizes the humble grief of Rizpah in her powerlessness, and he honors the dead from the house of his enemy. This is the king who we want and we need. More and more, and the more you see yourself rightly as an enemy of Jesus much of the time, in the way that we live and the way that we treat him and other people, more and more and more we should want this king, the one who honors and treats well even those who have been his enemies. Okay, well, time is almost gone, so very briefly on the soldiers. Fourth, the harder they fall. The unfinished business we have here is finally done in David. So the Philistines have been a problem for a long time. They were a problem with Samson, and then Eli and Samuel and Saul have all tried and failed to resolve it. They're a big deal. They have giants. But now, in his older years, through the bravery and the faith of his soldiers, David finishes the unfinished business and protects his sheep from their most dangerous wolves. The king's job is to protect the innocent from the harm that would come to them. So you look at the four individuals named. They're all champions. They're all, we're told, descendants of Rapha in Gath. They are all giants, mighty and taunting Israel. Do you see verse 21? Mocking God, just like Goliath had done right back at the beginning of David's story. Where is your God? What can he do? And the big message of these two books, 1 and 2 Samuel, what these books want to tell us is that in God's hands, the bigger they are, specifically the mightier they are, the prouder they are, the harder they fall. Verse 22, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. And so God's king completes his work and defeats the enemy. Again, that is the king that we need. Humble, just, promise-keeping, sacrificial and generous and victorious. That's what we need. So come back next week to think about whether that is what we get in David or in Jesus. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for Jesus and for his death on the cross. Thank you for a king who is faithful and kind and courageous and true. And we ask our Father that these chapters, this book, would draw us to him in love and in worship. We ask in his name. Amen.